Well, I think you'd be pretty hard pressed to find an album where the debut was so monumental that it pretty much defined the entire career of an artist to the point where they started to just re record it over and over again. Yeah, let's dive into this one.
Plus, Tubular Bells.
Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield. So this is another album within my classics month of August. Hope you guys are enjoying it. I'm having a blast recording some of these albums that we all know and love. So yeah, it gives me a chance to kind of stretch my legs and talk about an album without keeping my finger on the pulse of what's new, what's hot, what do I gotta talk about. Let's talk about a classic, a staple of progressive rock, Tubular Bells. Man, what can I say that hasn't already been said about this album? So for those of you that don't know about Mike Oldfield, Mike Oldfield kind of got his start as like a studio musician at Abbey Road back in the late 60s or early 70s, and allowed him to kind of play around and record a whole bunch of demos. And so he was recording a lot, and I mean, he was kind of one of the first multi-instrumentalists in terms of studio musicianship, trying to build up their own career. Kind of think of Trent Reznor from the 90s, right? He's shopping around and finally got a big break within a very young Virgin Records, I think it was, that gave him a chance and said, yeah, you have carte blanche on this thing. Get your project made. We'll put it out on this new record label because nobody else seems all that excited about it, so it's all yours. And the album exploded. We kind of all know the big claim to fame because as this album was making its rounds in 1973, the writer and director for The Exorcist loved it, and so put the opening kind of very creepy overlay of keyboard and synth work into The Exorcist, and that alone basically put it from a top 10 hit into the stratosphere of an album of legends, because it's very hard to kind of divorce The Exorcist theme with Tubular Bells because they're kind of one and the same. Now, it's only the first 4 or 5 minutes of the track, and each side of Tubular Bells is one half of the Tubular Bells track until into the 90s when we get Tubular Bells 2, 3, Millennium Bell, and all that kind of stuff. This is one of those rare instances where the album deserves all the praise and attention that it got at the time, especially for this young whippersnapper of Mike Oldfield. So I love how this album is orchestrated, and even though both are, I guess you can say arguably, instrumental pieces, the first track having a couple spoken word, the second track having this weird guttural nonsense sounds to it, even with these two big tracks being purely instrumental, it's always dynamic, it's always changing, it's always gripping, and it has your attention. Even with the first piece, where it starts off with that really creepy piano work that we all know from The Exorcist, going right into this big crescendo. And that's one of the things I love. Each piece has a very clear transition, and people that are writing 20 plus minute tracks can use some of the techniques and really take inspiration for how to use these as stepping stones, how to use these as proper techniques, because each piece has a very clear essence. It has a very clear purpose. There's a movement towards these tracks where it's all strung along into a singular piece of music, but there's always a very clear distinction from chapter to chapter to chapter, and a lot of that is through crescendos, through movements that elevate itself to the next movement. So once we move from that very piano outstretch with these bing moments on it into this more heavenly, now we're into the song proper with lots of overlays and very juicy aspects on it. And because Mike Oldfield is allowed to have basically carte blanche, he was able to overlay so many different aspects and so many different areas. The amount of production that's on this track is just astounding, with the overlay of instruments all working together, and really you've got the one guy that's basically just playing over himself over and over and over again to create all this music. It's astounding and groundbreaking. And as I mentioned, all these different kind of chapters within this track have a very clear and crystal unification about it and personality. I mean, we all love where it builds itself up into that guitar works, that electric guitar, that right? And then the big crescendo that we have at the end where it all kind of breaks down, it all kind of brings itself back into the center of the track, and it slowly builds up this like singular theme that just gets built upon and built upon and built upon until you basically get to one crescendo, and that's when they start introducing the instruments that will be coming up. And so it's like grand piano, two slightly distorted guitars, Spanish guitar, and introducing acoustic guitar, and like each one kind of builds upon the other and builds upon the other to this master crescendo until you have the final piece, which is and thus Tubular Bells, and we have this big like bang bang kind of sounds, and it's just so rich and so dripping in beauty. And that's just the first side. You know, I've covered a whole first side in that case. And we all know by now that the second part maybe is not quite as solid or as gripping as the first part, but it is equally as good and it is of equal quality to the first part. And it did take Mike Oldfield a little bit longer to write the second part as well. And I love how different and dynamic the second part is. I love, once again, we got that lush soundscapes, the orchestration and symphonic outpour of music on this. And I feel like it gets a little bit overshadowed from the first part, but it still is a little bit more subdued. It isn't as immediate as the first side, but it still has such a great teeth and climb on it, especially once we get to that midpoint where we have that like guttural growl of songs that almost sounds like this werewolf that is singing it. And I love how it's got like this nonsense kind of, at least to my ears, nonsense style of lyrics on it that all kind of comes to a head at the very end of the track and being this very jovial jaunt of almost like, I don't know, like fair type music, like this do 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 do. Like it's very fun, it's very whimsical, it's very like very different from the music that kind of came around it, and it shows that Mike Oldfield isn't afraid to have fun. Once again, the orchestration, and even though this track is like 21 minutes, it never wavers, it never feels dull, it never feels like it's getting boring or that you're just treading water. It's always going to something new and something fresh. And so it's hard to talk about this album without really going into the legacy after this, because after this, the next couple of years, we have like the orchestral Tubular Bells, which utilizes a full orchestra to bring about the actual sounds within it. We get a couple follow-ups with the 1-2 punch of Hardest Ridge and Omadon. I think Omadon is maybe my favorite from them. Because, you know, in the early 90s, we have Tubular Bells 2 and Tubular Bells 3, and it's followed up by the Millennium Bell, and then Tubular Bells 2013, and like each one taking on, kind of like taking from the legacy of the Tubular Bells movement and either recontextualizing it or reevaluating it in some ways. Sometimes it's something completely different. Other times it's kind of like a recomposition of the music around it. So yeah, this is one of the few, you know, tracks and albums that have followed the artist with them throughout their career, sometimes to, I don't want to say to the detriment, but it definitely was like everybody kind of comparing it to the original, which I'm not quite sure is fair. As I mentioned, Omadon is probably I actually like Omadon a little bit more than Tubular Bells, especially with Return to Omadon. But yeah, this album, once again, all of the praise that was going on for this album is 100% warranted. And it really did add a new dimension to the progressive rock scene that was at the time. It was almost like the auteur theory for music. You know, this was a Mike Oldfield project through and through because he took care of everything. Yeah, that's kind of what I've got for Tubular Bells. It is one of my favorite projects. It's a standout and a staple of progressive rock music. If you haven't heard it by now, please go and do yourself a favor and give it a listen. It is something I love to listen to during the fall, especially once Halloween comes around. And it's an absolute blast. It's an absolute blast. It's the kind of album that keeps on giving this far out from its recording. Like every time I listen to it, I get rewarded and there's something new to be found each time I listen to it. So yeah, go and listen to it because I friggin' love it. It's as I mentioned, it's a full-on masterpiece. You gotta listen to it. So that's what I've got for Tubular Bells from Mike Oldfield. What did you guys think about this album? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Whatever you thought, please let me know by commenting down below. I've been having a blast with all these classic albums. I'm about halfway through them at this point, and I've got a few more to talk about. So, yeah, I think I'm going to go maybe a little bit more modern. We'll see. But for now, that's all I've got for you guys today. Thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, Notes out.